What do this church and Atlantis have in common? The answer is a remarkable man called Giorgio Grognet de Vassé, who was not only a talented architect and engineer, but was also obsessed with the idea of Atlantis. So obsessed was he with proving that Atlantis had been a real place located in the central Mediterranean that he slipped into some controversial territory by being a part of several bizarre hoaxes. This is quite the story. It features Napoleon, it features missing megaliths, and it features a lost manuscript. So make a drink and let's go down the rabbit hole together. Giorgio Grognet de Vassé was born on the Mediterranean island of Malta in 1774. He was descended from French aristocrats who had settled in Malta over 100 years earlier. At the time of his birth, Malta was ruled by the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights ruled Malta and Gozo between 1530 and 1798 after losing Rhodes to the Ottomans in 1522 and being granted the islands by Emperor Charles V. Many buildings and structures still exist from Hospitaller Malta. Although Malta is pretty well known for its unique megalithic temples, I would say it's even better known for all the architecture related to the Knights, not least of which is the entire capital city of Valletta. Prior to the Knights settling permanently in Malta, Valletta didn't exist, which is hard to believe now. The capital had been in Mdina, a fortified city in the centre of the island, so the Knights initially settled in the coastal town of Birgu, establishing Fort St. Angelo, which was called Castrum Maris, meaning sea castle, and adding further defences. After the failed Ottoman siege of 1565, they decided to build a new capital, which is still the capital today. So this was the cultural milieu that Grognet was born into. When he turned 14, he was sent to the Seminario Tuscolano at Frascati just outside of Rome so that he could be educated for a career in the church. His father sent introductory letters to Angelo Cesarini, the rector of the seminary, and Henry Stuart, Cardinal Duke of York, who was the patron of it. So as you can see, Grognet was from a well-off and well-connected family. He stayed at the seminary for 7 years, where he would have studied the classics, Greek, Latin, and mathematics. Apparently, he was not particularly interested in pursuing the career in the church that his father had worked hard to prepare for him. However, he eventually relented, took minor orders, and returned to Malta with the position of an abbey. Against the backdrop of the French Revolution, these were dangerous times in Malta. Intellectuals had started to argue with and conspire against the Knights and their privileged status. Francophiles had started looking for a way out, and things had become rather unsettled. In 1797, a French war vessel pulled into the Grand Harbour in Valletta on its way to Corfu, which, along with the Ionian Islands, had been ceded to Napoleon's government. Grognet decided to abandon his career in the church, sneak out of Malta on this ship, and join the French Revolutionary Army. A letter written by Grognet from Corfu to his father a few months later has survived, as has his father's response, where they discuss a promotion he wants in the army. In 1798, Napoleon occupied Malta, a regime that was to last just 2 years and was to see the end of Hospitaller Malta before ushering in the British period. It was in the following year, during his invasion of Egypt, that the Rosetta Stone was discovered. There's no evidence that Grognet was involved in either of these expeditions. All that's known is that he eventually joined the engineering corps of the French Revolutionary Army and travelled back and forth between France and Italy before leaving the army for good to study in Rome. It was at that time that he won a place at the Accademia Archeologica del Campidoglio, and where he made the acquaintance of the French author and archaeologist, the Marquis Agricole de Fourche d'Urbain. The Marquis was heavily involved with the Asiatic Society of Paris, and in 1809 wrote a book hypothesizing that Malta was the remains of Atlantis, an idea that Grognet was to come to share. It was also at this academy that Grognet and the Marquis got to know the retired French military officer Grégoire Louis Dominique de Rienzi, a slippery character which we will get into later. He was also interested in Atlantis, but hypothesized that it had been located between Scandinavia and the plains of Tartary. On Grognet's return to Malta, he lodged at a boarding house in Valletta run by a couple who had 7 children. This is quite the come down for someone of his status, and appears to have been because the situation with his family was somewhat fraught. They had supported him financially on and off for years, even though they had given him a good education and the prospect of a career in the church. And they were not enamored with him having joined the French Revolutionary Army. In fact, his family had been part of the movement to get the regime out of Malta. So it was at this point that he found himself unable to live in his parents' grand palazzo and had to move into lodgings instead. Eventually, he married his landlady after she became widowed. Various drawings have survived from this time which show Grognet's interest in archaeology, architecture and engineering. After around 10 years of marriage, his wife died, and a few years later he married a Genoese Maltese woman who he had 2 children with, and it was during this time that he got involved with the most impressive project of his career. In 1614, a church had been built in the Maltese town of Mosta by the architect Tommaso Dingli. However, by the early 19th century, a larger building was needed to support a growing population. This was when Grognet decided to get involved. It appears that his finances were not in a good place, but he still offered his architectural and engineering services for a minimal charge. Since he didn't have formal architectural training, assistance from others was also needed. He had in mind to create a large domed church in the neoclassical style of the Pantheon in Rome. Not everyone liked the idea of a Roman temple being used as a template for the design of a Catholic church, but overall it ended up being regarded as a masterpiece. The Mosta parish priest, Father Calleja, was in full support of the project and even financed it. Its construction was completed in the 1860s and the resulting church is magnificent, with the dome being one of the largest unsupported domes in the world. Although Grognet mostly lived in Valletta, during the building work he lived at a house belonging to the notary Francesco Ceccuti, which is now called Casa Grognet. Grognet was fascinated by the Neolithic temples that were slowly coming to light on the islands of Malta. He saw these as the remnants of Atlantis. Some of the megalithic temples, such as Gigantia in Gozo and Hajar Imanum Niger in Malta, had been known about for a long time, but excavations only begun in the early 19th century. So Grognet took an interest in all of this that was happening around him. He painted the Gigantia temples, and he painted a polygonal megalithic wall that he said he had found in Mosta, the town where he built the church. It's important to mention, though, that no one else seems to have reported this wall. He drew a map marking the location of this structure and called it the Fortress of the Giants, as well as labelling an ancient town of blood, a field of giants and some cart ruts. As I've mentioned on previous videos, cart ruts are parallel tracks that can be found all over the Maltese islands, and their exact date and function aren't really known. But there has been quite a lot of research on them, and they were likely related to classical period quarrying activities. On the map he drew, he also marks the dry valley there, which is called the Valley of Honey, or Weed il Assel in Maltese, and he shows north at the bottom of the map. The area where Grognet claimed to find his Fortress of the Giants was eventually built upon. The British constructed a fort there, Fort Mosta, between 1878 and the 1880s. It seems that they didn't find any megalithic remains, only some Paleo-Christian catacombs which have been preserved. Another catacomb complex can also be found cut into the hillside near the fort. There were also plenty of cart ruts in the area, so in that he was accurate, but no megalithic remains have been found in the vicinity of the fort. On Google Earth, with north at the top, I can show you the areas that correspond with what Grognet marked on his map. To the best of my knowledge, no Neolithic remains have ever been found in any of these specific areas. But that said, a few hundred meters to the west, stone blocks resembling worked megaliths were discovered during more recent surveys, some of which are incorporated into modern rubble walls in various fields. So it's certainly possible that the area was yet another location of one or more megalithic temples. Neolithic burials and pottery have also been found close by. Some dolmens and some scattered megaliths can be seen just to the south as well. These likely date to the Bronze Age though. In 1854, Grognet wrote his own book on his hypothesis, a hypothesis that he shared with the Marquis, that Malta was the location of Atlantis. This is how he thought it had looked. Now, of course, these days we know that Malta and Gozo did used to be joined together and did used to be substantially larger than they are now when sea levels were lower during the Ice Age. However, the landmass didn't look like this, and there's no evidence of human habitation at that time. There were bears though, and lots of hippopotami and elephants. During Grognet's time back in Malta, as well as embarking on the grand project of the Mosta Dome and showing an interest in the megalithic history of the islands, he also became involved in some forgeries. However, the extent to which he was involved is debatable. In 1822, he became reacquainted with the retired French general Rienzi, who he had met in Rome. Rienzi revealed to him that in 1807 he had discovered a manuscript on the island of Gerba when travelling with the Greek scholar Ariston of Samos. Even though this had taken place before he had met Grognet at the academy in Rome, he chose to wait quite some years before he told him about it. By this time, Ariston of Samos, his co-discoverer, had been killed in a fire in Constantinople, so couldn't vouch for the whole thing. The 24-volume papyrus manuscript, written in Doric Greek, was entitled The History of Libya by Eumalos of Cyrene, and was supposedly a copy of a text originally authored by Aristippus of Cyrene in the 4th century BCE. Cyrene was an ancient Greek colony and Roman city in modern-day Libya. This manuscript placed Atlantis in Malta, matching the hypothesis of the Marquis and Grognet, but not that of Rienzi, and that's going to be important later on. Grognet was interested in looking at the text in more detail, so Rienzi agreed that he could have it for a few days, but in return he wanted help with the transliteration and translation of a bilingual Greek and Phoenician inscription on a stone artifact he had also found while travelling in Cyrene. He wanted Grognet to then send this inscription to 2 experts for authentication and then to the Marquis for presentation at the Asiatic Society in Paris. Grognet agreed, but having minimal time to analyse the manuscript before Rienzi was due to leave Malta, he simply copied chapter 6, the one that featured Atlantis, so that he could have a proper look at it later. Rienzi then travelled to Greece carrying the manuscript with him. Unfortunately, it was then stolen while he was travelling in the Peloponnese, and he apparently used all his connections to try to recover it, but to no avail. Back in Malta, Grognet had the bilingual inscription from the stone translated by a local Greek merchant and a Maltese expert in Phoenician. This Greek merchant Petzali was also tasked with translating chapter 6 of the manuscript into Italian. Once the stone inscription had been translated, it was sent to experts for authentication and then sent to the Marquis in 1827. The Marquis was also sent the translation of the chapter, which bolstered his own theory that Malta was the location of Atlantis. At the same time, an Italian author in Malta was writing the first guidebook on the country, called the Historical Guide to the Island of Malta and its Dependencies, in honour of the British governor Sir Henry Ponsonby. Parts of the translated chapter were sent to him to be included in the appendix. Here is a section about Atlantis as reproduced in the book Echoes of Plato's Island by Mifsud, Sultana and Ventura. He tells us that the second Atlas was the disciple of a certain Ninus, king of Babylon, nephew of the famous Ogyges. The latter was the king of Atlantis, the island which once existed between Libya and Sicily, and which was submerged. The large island was known as Decapolis, Atlantica, by our forefathers of Cyrene, as well as by the ancient Greeks. Ogyges was the king who governed the famous island at the time of the horrible inundation. The summit of Mount Atlas, which was situated in the middle of the island Atlantica, was not submerged. This summit of Mount Atlas has preserved the name of Ogyges from that of its last king, and it is in fact this circumstance why we still know it as Ogygia, that island which once exists between Libya and Sicily. It is nothing more than the summit of the Mount of Atlantica. So basically, it's saying that Atlantis was located between Libya and Sicily, which is where the Maltese Islands are, and it equates it with the island that, when the text was written, was called Ogygia. Now, many a classicist has looked into the possible location of Ogygia because, apart from this text, it was mentioned in Homer's Odyssey as the place where he was detained by the nymph Calypso. Some classicists do think that the Maltese island of Gozo may have been called Ogygia at that time, and that is why a cave there today is known as the Calypso Cave. So the implication of this text is that Malta and Gozo once made up the mountain peak of a larger landmass called Atlantis, which sunk in a natural disaster. Things got even more interesting in 1826 when Grognet received a stone artifact from a priest in the old capital of Mdina that he had found whilst digging in his backyard. This stone was engraved with a bilingual inscription in Latin and Phoenician. Grognet got help with the translation, which said that the Roman Emperor Sempronius Longus had given a date for the sinking of Atlantis. Since this was found in Malta, Grognet and the Marquis thought that it was another piece of evidence that supported their hypothesis for the location of Atlantis. The Marquis then presented the information from Chapter 6 and the inscription from the priest stone to the Asiatic Society in Paris on the 4th of February 1828. Rienzi returned to France several years later and was shocked at all the developments that had taken place in his absence, especially the fact that Grognet had revealed the information contained in Chapter 6. He wrote to the Marquis accusing Grognet of sending him a translation that might not be accurate, but he wasn't able to confirm either way since it had been lost in his shipwreck and he couldn't quite remember himself what it said. In 1832, the authenticity of the inscription on the stone found in Cyrene was questioned, and 3 years later it was confirmed as a forgery. The same fate befell Chapter 6, which was discredited by several authors, and the priest's stone. So there we have it, 3 forgeries, 2 of which were designed to bolster the hypothesis that Malta and Gozo are the remains of Plato's Atlantis. I can't seem to find anywhere what the first forgery actually said. Maybe that was also related to Atlantis. One of the authors of the book Echoes of Plato's Island, Anton Mifsud, wrote a paper in 2024 entitled Giorgio Grognet de Vassé, Forger or Victim. He argues that Rienzi was the forger of the Cyrene inscription and the manuscript, and that Grognet simply believed what Rienzi had given to him. Mifsud goes into a lot of detail on this, and it seems that Rienzi did have a long history of faking texts, artifacts, and travelogues. The priest stone is more difficult to explain. Mifsud argues that the hoax may have been perpetrated by some people in the church who were annoyed that Grognet had turned his back on his career with them. That seems a bit far-fetched to me, but I'm quite amenable to the idea that Grognet bought into these forgeries that he had no part in creating, and that he was simply so committed to his hypothesis that he was willing to believe anything that would support it. The obsession with Atlantis itself is not surprising, considering that from the 1600s onwards, ruins had started to capture the imagination of aristocrats and artists, and the first antiquarians had started excavating at ancient sites from Egypt to Stonehenge. There are lots of anthropological studies that look into how the ancient past was viewed at the time and how that fit with politics and ideology. An interesting paper by the anthropologist Professor Paul Sancassier on Grognet and the Atlantis affair suggests, and I quote, "Could we not see in his project an unconscious desire to marry the two together? Nationalism and archaeology, for he projected Malta as a symbolically far larger land than a mere island, indeed a lost continent potentially recoverable through a self-referential scholarship that he himself manufactured, an land and therefore an civilization." Of course, you would need to read the whole paper referenced below to get a bit more context, but essentially Grognet was a person of his time. And I would say quite a romantic. He joined the French Revolutionary Army, not for money or connections, but for some sort of ideology. He was comfortable giving up the living prepared for him by his father to live in a lodging house in Valletta, and he was so enamoured with the Mosta dome project that he barely wanted paying for it. Rather bizarrely, 2 texts written by Grognet on his engineering and architectural projects don't simply mention him as the author, but refer in the title to him as being the author of Atlantide. He made sure that he was inextricably linked to the hypothesis that Malta had been Atlantis in everything that he did, whether it was related or not. The 2 things that really bother me about the whole Atlantis Grognet story is, firstly, why didn't Rienzi's faked manuscript list his favoured location as the place of Atlantis? Why did Rienzi go to all that effort to forge a manuscript that didn't support his personal hypothesis? And why was he then so angry that Grognet had translated the chapter and had it sent to the Marquis? Perhaps we're looking at a forgery on top of a forgery. Secondly, why did no one else in the early 19th century mention the megalithic wall in Mosta? At the time, antiquarians were very busy digging up other sites, so it seems plausible that they would have been drawn to a structure that was, according to the painting, pretty intact. There's no reason why Grognet would have faked that, since several megalithic buildings had already been found on the islands and no one doubted that Malta had been inhabited far into the past. Although at the time I think they were thought of as Phoenician structures. Furthermore, the cart ruts he labelled in that area do exist. I wonder if it wasn't a way of tying his Mosta dome project into the Atlantis idea, a way of saying that his magnificent edifice was there to commemorate Malta's illustrious origins as Atlantis, and some remains of that golden age did indeed still survive in Mosta, just as in other parts of the island. I'm not saying he made it up, there probably were megaliths there, but perhaps he exaggerated what he saw in the painting. Or he got the location mixed up and he actually painted a wall that was found somewhere to the west where megaliths have been found. All the essays I've used to produce this summary of the Atlantis Grognet affair are listed in the description below. It's a complicated story. There's a lot more that we could talk about, and a deeply fascinating one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.